Mhm. Hopefully, Jonathan, you should see the first slide.
Yep, I can see the first slide, and it looks like I've got recording in the top left-hand corner, so I think we're all good.
We're we're all good. Fantastic. Well then, let's start. This presentation really covers the soft emergence of a kind of subdiscipline that we're considering of security cybernetics. It comes out of my thesis, and rather like the picture, the emergence has been soft. It's not been a deliberate pathway. It's just something that's kind of come out of the work. So what I'm going to do is try and describe how that process took place, but also make reference to my main paper in the thesis, which relates to data variety. So, what is the problem? What are the problem I was looking at? Well, the the issue for me was to look at the future of polis. Polis, the body of citizens of the Greek state, um, the Greek city-state, um, society, in other words, and a new way of, or the new challenges of how society regulates itself, particularly in terms of policing. Um, Policing at the moment still has strong antecedents in traditional bureaucracies, and very sort of physical presence within the population. But in the context of the emerging fourth industrial revolution, I was looking at in the thesis what are the issues for transformation to what I call Polis 2.0, the second version or a new version of policing. In that process, I came across three main areas of theory. And whilst reading will take you to um, particular up to date views on original work, my own conclusion from looking at cybernetics, games theory, and complexity theory is that actually a lot of the original content, a lot of what is kind of baseline knowledge in these disciplines absolutely stands true for security. So whether we look at the work of Ashby, Beer, or Norbert Wiener in Cybernetics, just in the top grid there, um, or whether we look at games theory, um, Nash, von Neumann, and of course Alan Turing, um, or whether we look at complexity, Ilya Prigogine, um, Oliver Sacks is a really interesting case in terms of medicine, or indeed Edward Lorenz and the development of complexity theory. I found myself relating back the original theory tremendously. So for me, security cybernetics very much stands on the shoulders of these giants. Yeah. Another interesting point I'd like to raise in terms of games theory is the idea of an infinite game. This comes from um, um, more modern thinking, in fact, but it takes the principles of um, a lot of finite games, and basically takes security situations and how they might be played. So the infinite game, developed by somebody called Peirce around about 2012, uh, taken further by management consultant Sinek in 2019, looks at essentially a game that never ends. And you don't win an infinite game. The only result you can have is actually staying in the game. So the example he would use is the US Army in Vietnam didn't actually lose that many contacts, didn't actually lose the physical war, but lost the will and resources to stay in the game, and ultimately withdrew. And you can kind of see the same things perhaps in Afghanistan. Um, and certainly if you transpose some of those lessons of staying in the game they certainly apply to crime space and the organized crime space. So having a just cause, trusting teams, having a worthy rival, but most importantly, the capacity to adapt and courageous leadership creates a whole new demand for being relevant, strategically relevant in terms of the game of delivery of security. And that's certainly the games theory element of security cybernetics. And so we come to definition, a working definition of security cybernetics, and that is an infinite game of adapting and deploying dynamic capabilities to effectively regulate threats. You can't win against a security threat, although that's often the narrative and the hyperbolic kind of headlines that we might see in the press. You can only regulate them, and that's very much the application of Ashby's law. And of course, within the technology environment and the mega trends that we're now seeing um, within a proliferating, complex, but also probabilistic and ever-changing security landscape. So that capacity to adapt is absolutely vital. In the fourth industrial revolution, thinking of the World Economic Forum, these are the kinds of issues that we can see affecting the security or the policing environment. Whether it's the development of cyber physical systems, economic, technology, or social megatrends, complexity, the impact of networks, nonlinearity, and all of those other things combined in very, very dynamic ways. Essentially, it means that society is presently and will continue to be perturbated in ways we've not previously experienced. And so, therefore, Polis 2.0 looks at how we might respond in terms of capabilities for that scenario. Of course, and I think it was Ford who initially asked customers about the motor car in the second industrial revolution, and the answer was they didn't really want a motor car; they just wanted someone to build faster horses. We're not in that game anymore. Things are very much changing. Like the motor car came along, faster horses don't work. Perhaps our traditional approaches may not be relevant for that much longer. So transforming to Polis 2.0, I took three papers in the thesis. First of all, I looked at data, and that's going to be the in-depth study of this presentation. But I've also written papers on skills and knowledge and innovation. Data is driving the need for different capabilities built on skills and knowledge, and innovation is that kind of perpetual propensity to self-organize and emerge new capabilities. Research method. This is an interesting picture. It's a print from William Blake, Head of the Damned Soul, which is a copy of of another work by his friend Henry Fuseli. The reason why I put this up is that what I found during the research, and I'll come on to it in a little bit more depth, is that people are actually stressed because of the data environment. They were treating the process almost as of interviewing, almost as a form of catharsis. So I thought that's a really interesting depiction. I'll mention more about that in a second. The thesis methodology followed something called engaged scholarship. It differs from traditional, I say traditional forms of academic inquiry, in the fact that if you can see the cursor, we start at 6 o'clock in reality. We don't start with theory, particularly, although it is an iterative process. And we try and look at the problems, what's happening in reality. In my case, observing the systems cybernetically. And I was seeing some data-related symptoms, and there they are listed. Some ones to highlight there: progress is challenging, skills deficit, disrupted environments, constantly perturbated environments, not stable. So the homeostat wasn't working effectively. I wanted to look at these problems, not to try and prove anything, but just to try and understand them. I looked at the kind of nature of the knowledge, the epistemic justification, and a form of reasoning that would help me in that process. And what I kind of saw is what we have summarized there: complex reality, and quite a lot of theory, fragmented theory, covered the three topics I was looking at. But overall, I was looking at cybernetics and complexity, but also the philosophy and reasoning from pragmatism, which I'll mention slightly later. But this wasn't trying to prove anything, as I say. This was about discovery. So taking the model around, we had a very extensive research design looking at interviewing systems agents or actors, people in the system, semi-structured interviews supported by case studies. In terms of taking the final kind of part of the engaged scholarship loop, and that's should just mention that's Andrew van der Ven's work down in Oxford. We were looking at potential diagnosis and pointers towards strategy. But I also took it a stage further and I looked at Solution Plus and a range of products that were delivered, including some planning for postdoctoral work as well. So that's the kind of research process that I followed. I mentioned pragmatism, particularly drew on the work of Charles Sanders Peirce. There's the reference, his lecture, Fixation of Belief, 1877. The key points from this are that belief and truth are dynamic, and Sanders Peirce offers four types of truth: a priori, stuff that's kind of taken for granted, and it's always been that way; tenacity, and that is really tacit knowledge, where people build up their responses based on, I've seen one of these situations before, therefore it must be one of those. Method of authority, which is a really interesting one, where the truth is determined by institutions or significant actors within a system. They tell us what to believe and how to believe it. And then finally, method of science. And this is a really, really important one. So I think method of science lends itself to cybernetical thinking. The research design, 41 actors, a diagonal cross-section of law enforcement, general contractors involved in change management, to data providers, to national policing, and 10 technologists from the security sector. 63 filed interviews between an hour and a quarter and just under 5 hours. That might sound exhaustive. They were done in sort of 1 hour or 1.5 hour tranches, and people just wanted to keep going. And this was the bizarre thing that I found, that people felt catharsis. People said to me that feels like counselling once they'd offloaded all of their particular views on the systems they were in. This was all done during COVID using various video conferencing platforms. The transcriptions were the recordings were then transcribed on using speech to text AI and then coded onto a database called NVivo, combined with case studies and artifacts, and that became the basis of the thesis papers. So very in-depth method that delivered far too much content, but gave me an incredibly rich picture of the systems I was looking at. I'm now going to dive a little bit more into data and data variety in particular. And of course, that will be of cybernetic interest. Here's a quote from Stafford in Decision and Control that basically people take variety almost for granted. People have been content to say that it's variety, but not actually break it down, understand it. And a certain amount of confusion has resulted. So what I basically did is through experience, through dialogue, through working with people, I came up with a framework to look at the characteristics of data. It's the V9 framework, and you can see the V's highlighted on the left-hand side of this slide. And essentially what it creates is a form of meta-variety or meta-complexity. It's not just variety in terms of a system being on or off or in discrete states. This has recursive layers, and they are dynamic, they're liquid, and they are forever changing. We could go into lots of detail. I could spend a whole hour on just this particular framework, but if we can just remember the V9 approach and characteristics of data, that will be helpful. And just looking at the right-hand side, these probabilistic characteristics challenge the way we interpret data and therefore information. We talk a lot about artificial intelligence, large language models at the moment, but also human bias amplifies error as well as AI. So when we start to look at things like criminal justice evidence, we recognize the need for very careful curation, but most importantly, variety attenuation, because all of these V9s create a huge amount of complex variety. During the course of the research, myself and some colleagues contributed to an attempt to start to consider attenuation of variety through the European Telecommunication Standards Institute and a technical standard for digital material being used in legal proceedings. The interesting point I'd like to sort of draw out from that piece of work is DIPCV, data integrity, provenance, continuity, and validity. It's a way of authenticating the validity of data because what we're seeing now increasingly is the reliability of data and therefore the information needs to be forensically considered, not just for evidence, but also sometimes for decision-making purposes. So we talked about DIPCV and data validity. This slide here represents a piece of work that I spoke to a national policing working group for the chief scientific advisor's work stream looking at data as evidence. And what I've basically done here is looked at data validity and the environmental poetic influences around data validity. And again, not to go into huge amounts of data, but if we just look at the issue of entropy and kind of noise in systems, we can see history repeating itself, particularly in relation to large-scale investigations, whether it was the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry and the subsequent Lawrence Byford report, whether it was the Bichard report after the Soham murders, Folly and Jessica, that was what, 2002, or whether indeed it was the Sarah Everhard murder and the fact that Darren Cousins, sorry, not Darren Cousins, Wayne Cousins, was known in various systems. The entropy is information sitting there as essentially noise of no use. And what we're seeing is entropy contributing to kind of noise in that that validation process. The validation process itself requires something I would call evidence inference confidence filtering. And that's essentially being able to transduce it from data from its raw state into something that's admissible in evidence. The same for information, and you can see the criminal justice um, sort of aspiration there of a professionalized and sustainable regulatory capability of praxis to absorb stochastically natural data probabilism, and it continues. So the challenge is taking this thing called data variety, understanding its various characteristics, and then being able to effectively and consistently and repeatedly and in a calibrated manner turn that into evidence. During the research, I looked at artificial intelligence, and it is fundamentally clear that artificial intelligence, which is kind of demonstrated in this schematic. So we have a relevant population generating data that helps train a machine learning model that provides outputs, decisions, and actions that taken that affect the relevant population. And you have this kind of what might be deemed almost a positive feedback loop. Bias has been a big feature in relation to sort of training data sets, but there are certainly I've identified 8 forms of complex interacting biases that create kind of noisy or entropic data. And we end up with different versions of the truth being generated by that system. The system is never isomorphic with reality, it never mirrors reality. And of course, we then come back to the idea of cybernetic black boxes. And of course, if we're trying to account for that artificial intelligence in a forensic manner, that's incredibly challenging. We can see it in things like the well-known and well articulated error rates within ANPR, automatic number plate recognition systems. So that's machine efforts, but equally with human efforts, there are significant forms of variety within the criminal justice system. We've had examples, and I'll just take you to point 2 here. Huge misinterpretations of data, telecommunications data, 20 odd thousand cases affected within the Danish criminal justice system because the data wasn't interpreted correctly. And in the UK, an example of case law there, which is R.V. Callan, where a non-expert was trying to give expert opinion or evidence of a particular data set that they were not qualified to do, and the case was dismissed. So we've got this complex array of human and machine generating error. What can be done about it? Well, my suggestion is that we look at man and machine expert witness, and that's my weak attempt at Latin there, homo et apparatus spiritus testis. Actually treating the human and the machine as a system and looking at the cybernetic and informational processes and building in attenuation accordingly. And when we look to articulate that that information or that data, that we do so in a consistent manner. And this is the evidence-inference-confidence framework, or a version I used in the thesis, where we have defined levels of confidence. It could be a star rating, it could be simply an articulated rating. That's on the left-hand side. We have a description of that rating, so it's very, very clear and standard what that confidence level actually means. We qualify that description through comments, but most importantly, and this was a lesson from the Butler inquiry and weapons of mass destruction around the decision to go to war with Iraq, we have very clear and standard lexicon so that a layperson or another professional can properly understand what is being articulated in relation to sometimes and perhaps increasingly more complex data. So this is a kind of way of attenuating all of that variety and attaching a level of confidence. It is no longer deterministic. We can only articulate the level of confidence in inference that can be drawn from data sets because of its stochastic and probabilistic nature. Something else that came up in the research was chronic impacts on systems. And essentially, what we're saying here is there is an allostatic loading effect. It's kind of creating a kind of illness within systems where on the left-hand side, lots of data variety is being generated, and it's going into policing systems in its various forms, but it's not being effectively attenuated. And when my interviewees were expressing frustration, catharsis, and counselling, it was very much reflective of this kind of pressure that data is creating within the policing system. So we look at the ideas of well-being, whether it's of persons or recursively of people into organizations. And again, I can't go into detail on this slide, but we can start to look at well-being, the signals, the symptoms, potentially some of the illnesses that can generate within systems, and some regenerative responses. I did finally have the luxury of testing all of my work through a training course for 160 so far, senior security officials from a range of disciplines for an overseas university. We kind of taught them things like the adaptive security homeostat. This is a direct application of Ashby's law, looking how to regulate disturbances and variety in a system to effectively deliver that infinite game response. That's it, mathematically expressed. So the change in the variety of the outcome is a product of a change in the variety of the disturbance, which is dynamic, taking away a change in the variety of the response. And that is a constant strategic imperative now in the data environment. What caused me to do all this? Well, I spent best part of a decade in some very challenging national data environments, both for policing and in a kind of national security context. And these questions around data and disruption were troubling me. I didn't know how to quite think them through. But it was moving from the dissatisfaction and doubt as a state into something which has popped up the other side of this research, which is a state of belief that has been my own personal journey. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Richard. I'll hit stop on the recording now.